So my remit at the council is fairly broad, but happily for me, a lot of the projects I work on are in some way related to land use, which is an area of particular interest to me. And as you're going to tell from some of the information I'm giving you later today, a lot of my passion for natural heritage in the Highlands really began with my involvement in the Flow Country World Heritage Site project, which some of you may be aware of. I was coordinator of that project up until February of 2020. And this experience gave me an appreciation of the powers, but also the limitations of natural heritage designations, as well as an understanding of the different ways in which local audiences view a new designation as it is being proposed and as it comes into effect in their area. So in today's event, we're going to think about what natural heritage is, why it's worth protecting, and how it can be protected through designations. And then we're going to use Sluggan's peatland, which is an area just outside of Portree, as a case study. So it's an area which doesn't currently have a local authority designation, and we're going to look at whether or not the introduction of one would change things, whether that would have a positive, a negative, or a neutral effect. I've set some time aside at the end for a discussion, which is going to be structured around questions that I'm going to propose throughout the presentation. So we'll have all our discussion at the end. You'll see the questions during the presentation, and then I'll put them up on the screen again at the end, just to structure what we're talking about. In the discussion, I'm not going to pick on anyone. So if you just want to sit quietly, that's absolutely fine, but I would be delighted if you put your hand up and got involved in the discussion section. We're scheduled for 90 minutes today, but I just wanted to reassure you that it's not going to be 90 minutes of me talking about the designations and definitions of natural heritage. This is Climate Fèis. It's a festival. It's supposed to be fun. So there are a few short videos in between my talk, and there's also a coffee break just towards the end of today's presentation. The final thing I'd like to say before we get started is a big thank you to the organisers of Climate Fèis. So we're really pleased at the council to be involved. So hi there, Connor. I'm just going to mute you just so we don't hit up. And I think Katie's quicker than me. So we're really pleased to be involved in Climate Fèis, and we understand how much effort and how much work is involved in pulling together something like this. So thank you very much for letting us be involved. So we're going to start by looking at what natural heritage is. And I think this is a worthy question because one of the main reasons Nature Scott, the public body responsible for our natural heritage, changed its name from Scottish Natural Heritage is because people kept getting confused about what their responsibility actually was. Is heritage something to do with our castles and our forts and things like that? And it's one of the reasons they changed their name to Nature Scott. But before I start talking about these definitions, I just want to put a tiny disclaimer in that in today's presentation, I'll be focusing almost entirely on terrestrial or land-based natural heritage. This is mostly due to the oceans being outside my area of expertise, but even further to this, as we're using the Sluggan's peatlands and also climate change to structure today's presentation, you might find that my presentation leans towards these carbon-rich soils more than to other habitat types. So the term natural heritage is not perhaps as scientific a term as biodiversity or habitat or ecosystem, which makes defining it a little more challenging. In many ways, it's a subjective term that means different things to different people. For some, natural heritage refers to the natural features that have conservation, scientific, or aesthetic values. A good example would be an old native woodland. But even within this broad definition, there are differences of opinion. Is something only natural if it has been untouched by humans? And if this is the case, is there anywhere in the UK which can be said to be natural? If not, what extent of human interference is acceptable if we are still to refer to an area, a landscape or a feature as natural? For other people, however, it is perfectly acceptable to include cultural landscapes such as the stone-walled, sheep-covered hillsides of the Lake District as part of our natural heritage. For these people, the relationship between humans and the land is the defining component of natural heritage, rather than a disqualifying feature. This viewpoint might also include those who consider humans to be custodians of nature. You hear a lot of environmental organizations speaking in this way, and that it is our aim to conserve and protect the environment for future generations. This is a much more hands-on approach to natural heritage. And I think finally, it's also important to include a geographic definition, which might view everything outside of our urban areas as natural. Living in Glasgow for a couple of years, as I did, lots of people consider active agricultural areas, tourist-covered beaches, man-made fishing ponds part of our natural heritage. This viewpoint tends to focus less on issues such as ecosystems, biodiversity and habitat, and much more on a feeling of naturalness. So we're now going to take a look at our first video of today, which gives one perspective on natural heritage. It's a video from UNESCO, explaining how it defines natural heritage in the context of World Heritage Site designation, some of which are natural sites, such as the Great Barrier Reef. As you watch this video, you'll see that many of the images are of people, communities, and culture. It's not just swamps, trees, and deserts, and which perhaps reflects the aims of UNESCO itself. So I'm going to move us on to the video now and then come back just to finish up on this slide. Okay, it will start in just a few seconds. Okay, so I think that's a nice video to start with because it really puts people at the centre of natural heritage. So a lot of what UNESCO is focusing on is the benefits that people get from natural heritage, maybe to the local economy or to things such as agriculture or quality of water. I think that's really important, but it also highlighted that we are also the main threats. So extraction such as oil extraction, gas extraction. So we're also posing the main threats too. Okay, so I wasn't putting forward any of these definitions of natural heritage as the final answer as to what it is. But this does bring us to our first question, which will be discussed in more detail at the end, and that is how much human interference is too much? Is there a point at which there has been too much human interference with a landscape or habitat or scenic view so that it can no longer be called natural heritage? So that's one of the questions we're going to discuss at the end. So we'll look at all the questions at the end of today's presentation. And just as we've had a couple of people join a little bit later on, I'll say that we are recording the presentation at the moment, but when we get to the discussion section, I'll end the recording, so that section won't be recorded. Okay, so we're going to go to the next part of our slide today, and we're going to talk about biodiversity and habitats. So in 2019, the Highland Council declared a climate and ecological emergency. In doing so, we were recognising not only the serious reality of human-influenced climate change, but also the impact we're having on biodiversity and habitats. These are, of course, all interlinked. To look at how environmental designations can be used to protect biodiversity and habitats, which has to form a huge part of our natural heritage, I'm going to focus on one particular designation to begin with, and that is Sites of Special Scientific Interest, or SSSIs. So a SSSI can be designated by NatureScot, formerly known, as I said earlier, as Scottish Natural Heritage, which is the public body here in Scotland responsible for our natural heritage. NatureScot describes SSSIs as the essential building blocks for conservation in Scotland. These areas of land and water are selected to best represent our natural heritage in terms of their flora, fauna, geology, geomorphology, which means landforms, and other natural features. SSSIs are quite numerous in Scotland. We've got over 1,400 currently listed, which covers over 12% of Scotland's land area. Sites range from being very small, perhaps just 1 hectare, up to enormous sites such as the one in the Cairngorms, which is just under 30,000 hectares. SSSIs are chosen following detailed surveys and evaluations by NatureScot. They use specific guidelines for each habitat that they're considering listing. Part of the process of inscribing a new SSSI is to contact all the landowners and give a rationale for the designation, and also an explanation of how this might change what they can and can't do on the land, and that's where some of the conflict can arise. So this brings me to the protective powers of a SSSI. What can and can't be done once this designation has come into place? SSSIs are statutory designations. It is an offence for anyone to intentionally or recklessly damage the protected natural features of a SSSI. This does not mean that all activity or human activity within the designated area must stop, but it does mean that certain features of that area must be protected. This could mean that it's still fine to walk your dog along a defined footpath, but it is not okay to take a quad bike out onto the blanket bog, which isn't a good idea anyway. It would be difficult to adequately enforce the protections of a SSSI without the cooperation and engagement of the landowners. This is one of the key components of protecting our natural features. The majority of SSSIs are on private land, so it's really important that NatureScot and also the local authority works with the landowners and managers to ensure that the site's natural features are being appropriately managed and that the protections given by the SSSI are well understood. Now, in practice, a SSSI works by requiring landowners and managers to apply to NatureScot to obtain consent to carry out certain land management practices within designated areas. It could be from something very small, seemingly like putting up a fence, to something a little bit bigger, like putting up a wind turbine. This allows NatureScot to evaluate whether or not these important natural features will be harmed before any action on the ground has taken place. The local authority can also be involved in these conversations. So our second question for today, which again is going to be addressed at the end of the presentation, is whether issues of biodiversity and habitat loss risk being overshadowed by our focus on climate change. And if so, is this a bad thing? I think that this is in some way reminiscent of the discussion around charismatic megafauna and charitable donations. You often see that large, interesting, cute or ferocious animals like polar bears or tigers receive vastly more donations and attention than an endangered sea slug or a bat or a mosquito or something like that. And in a similar vein, is there a risk that we're not giving enough attention to the biodiversity crisis because too much of our attention is drawn to the climate emergency? Or are they so interlinked that it doesn't matter? That's something to discuss later on. So we're going to go to our next page now, where we're going to focus on designations, natural heritage, and climate change in particular. So we're going to focus on some of the climate change benefits that can come with protecting our natural heritage. And we're going to begin by watching a short interview with Professor Roxanne Anderson, who some of you may be aware of. She's based in the Highlands up in Thurso. She's a peatland researcher. She works at the Environmental Research Institute, which is part of the University of Highlands and Islands. And she is one of the best people in the world to explain the importance of peatlands, including why their protection can help us to avoid the worst effects of climate change. I think in Scotland, and I learned this from her, that we can be quite proud of how we protect our peatlands. We're one of the best in the world for doing so. We've covered vast areas of peatland with environmental designations, and we've got many organisations whose main focus is restoring and protecting these habitats, at the same time as educating visitors, politicians and landowners about their value. So I'm now going to hand over to Roxanne, and this video is an interview with her from the Royal Society of Edinburgh. So the video will start in just a few seconds.
name is Roxanne Anderson.
Okay, right. I hope you enjoyed that. It's with me, it's kind of preaching to the converted that I'm going to agree with everything Roxanne says, because you know, I really do believe that restoring our carbon-rich soils is one of the best things that we can do, certainly in Scotland, in order to sort of help to make our contributions to the fight against climate change. And it's something that pays back not just now, but it pays back over generations. You can lock that carbon away for far longer than we'll be alive. It's something that's, in terms of cost benefit, it's a small investment for a huge advantage. Now, I saw, Anna, that you had some trouble watching the video and that you tried to click on it yourself. I don't think you can start the video yourself. So for the next video, when I play it, hopefully now that you've restarted Teams, it will start working. So just reflecting on that video we've just seen, when we're considering habitat management generally and the protection of our natural spaces, the rule of thumb is that a healthy habitat locks carbon away, while an unhealthy habitat leaks carbon into the atmosphere and our waters. So in the case of peatlands, as Roxanne was discussing, a dry bog can be a net emitter of greenhouse gases. In fact, there's been some research, which you might have seen in the paper over the last few months, that our bogs can be huge emitters of greenhouse gases when they're in poor condition. But a wet, healthy bog can lock away enormous amounts of CO2 for hundreds, if not thousands of years if kept in good condition. Equally, an old, species-diverse patch of rainforest is very similar, which is, it locks away a lot more carbon, which is why in many cases it's far more important to prevent old areas of forest being cut down than it is to plant new trees in a currently unforested area, although we do of course need to do both. Environmental designations can shine a spotlight on important natural spaces, and as can big conferences like COP26, as Roxanne mentioned. They let landowners and managers know the value of the land they're on, and they encourage responsible behaviour by visitors, developers and politicians alike. So we're just going to go to the next page now and talk a little bit about international designations. So in addition to some of the local designations, which we're going to consider later, we protect our natural heritage in Scotland with international environmental designations, such as the European Special Areas of Conservation, the SACs. You might be thinking, as a European designation, that Brexit might have affected this, but our exit from the EU has not altered the standards of protection for these sites. So land management within SACs has remained the same even after Brexit. The introduction of an SAC protects one or more special habitats and or species. We have 243 SACs in Scotland, including both on land and offshore, covering 2.47 million hectares in total. The largest terrestrial on land SAC area can now be seen on the screen. It covers some of the best quality portions of blanket bog in the flow country, which is the area that Roxanne Anderson was talking about. Okay, so if you have very good eyesight, you might be able to read some important information in the key, but if you don't, I can remember what it says because I can't read it either, and I can let you know what's in that key. So in the bottom right hand of the map. So the first thing you might notice, if you could read the key, is that the SAC is just one of 3 blanket bog designations in the flow country area. You can see different colours actually overlapping each other there. So you've got vertical purple stripes for one designation, and then you've got horizontal blue stripes going over much the same area. So this SAC is overlain with a SSSI as well, which is the designation we spoke about on the former page. These protected areas also comprise a Ramsar site. That's the yellow line going around all of the purple and blue hatched areas. Ramsar is an international designation for important wetlands. This is actually a common phenomenon where designations are laid one on top of the other, as the land is found to match criteria for multiple different designations. You can also see a red line circling a much wider area on the map there. So this is the consultation area we used for the Flow Country World Heritage Site project. So when we went out into the communities up in Caithness and Sutherland, we used this red line and we said, we consider the flow country, which doesn't currently have a map, to be somewhere in here. And can you tell us where you think, from your perspective, that line should be drawn? So there may yet be another designation for the region on top of those which already exist. International designations such as these bring more attention to a site than local or national designations. In the case of World Heritage Sites, for example, this designation can offer a significant profile boost, which may bring tourism, research, and financial benefits to a region. These designations also bring a degree of international scrutiny to natural heritage, with higher social and reputational costs for any damage done. I'm sure everyone has read about the mass coral bleaching events on the Great Barrier Reef, a World Heritage Site, but have perhaps not read so much about similar bleaching on other reefs which are not World Heritage Sites. So while a World Heritage Site is not a statutory designation once inscribed, the host country does not particularly want to lose that status because it's quite embarrassing. Liverpool waterfront, you might have seen in the news, lost its World Heritage status quite recently, which was a huge national blow. This is due to continual inappropriate development on the World Heritage Site. Immediately after that, the newspapers were full of stories about whether or not Stonehenge could lose its World Heritage Site status due to road developments nearby. So while there's not a statutory obligation coming with World Heritage, the government certainly doesn't want the reputational damage of losing World Heritage Site status because it says something about how well they're protecting their natural and cultural heritage. And this brings us to the next question of this discussion, which we'll answer at the end of today's presentation. Do the risks of over-tourism, such as being experienced in Orkney with their World Heritage Site, the Giant's Causeway as well, the Lake District, do these risks outweigh the benefits of an international or national designation? So that's just something to think about, and we'll come back to that question at the end of today's presentation. Okay, so I'm just going to briefly touch, we've just done international designations. I'm going to briefly touch on national designations. So these are our largest internal designations, and in many ways they're quite similar to the international ones. So these designations include national parks, national nature reserves, national scenic areas, and the SSSIs I've mentioned previously. I'm just going to focus on one of them at the moment, the designation of a National Nature Reserve, or an NNR. NNRs are awarded to the best nature reserves in Scotland. You can have a local nature reserve, and then the best of these become national nature reserves. There are 43 NNRs in Scotland, covering just over 150,000 hectares of land. There are two main purposes for establishing an NNR, and those are to conserve important habitats and species and to give people the opportunity to enjoy and connect with nature. So this is a very different ethos to, for example, a SSSI, which does not put leisure at the forefront, of their purpose. So NNRs tend to be managed by landowners such as Forestry and Land Scotland, the National Trust, or the RSPB. We're going to take a look now at the Abernathy National Nature Reserve, which is managed by the RSPB. The video takes a look at their efforts to restore the natural environment, work with local partners, and put funding into the ground to give biodiversity a boost and reduce our impact on the climate. So I think as you watch this, it's interesting to try and pick apart the aims of the RSPB and the impact of the NNR. Okay, so the video will start in just a few seconds. Okay. What I really like about that video is it shows the scale of the challenge that faces some of these areas, which have these natural heritage designations, and the real necessity for partnership work, especially when you see these contractors coming in with the diggers. You see a helicopter coming in. You know, this is maybe not something that an individual landowner will be able to do, perhaps financially, or perhaps for not having the right set of skills within the organization. And it shows how much partnership work is required when doing things on a big landscape scale to look after these areas, such as national nature reserves. I think the video also raised a couple of cultural issues, which we'll have a look at a little bit later. You might have noticed that one of the pieces of text that was put up on the screen gave the reason for the degradation of the peatlands as the area being overgrazed and burned over the years, referring to traditional land practices, perhaps associated with crofting or other types of agriculture, which is another area of conflict, which we'll discuss a little bit later on. Okay, we're just going to go to the next page now. Here we are, which is our tea break. So I thought, because this event today is lasting over quite a long period of time, it might be a good idea to take 10 minutes just to go and get a cup of tea or stretch your legs a little before going to the next part of the event, when we're going to talk about the leisure benefits, the cultural considerations of natural heritage spaces, and then we're going to look at the Sluggans peatlands as a case study to see what impact a local designation might have. So it's 10:43 now, so maybe if we have 12 minutes, if you're back by 10:55, we'll start again there. So I'm going to go get a cup of tea, and I'll see you back at 10:55. Okay, so bye for now, guys. Okay, hi there everyone. So we're going to get started again now after our tea break. Hopefully you managed to do something relaxing and take a break from listening to me. I realise I didn't introduce the picture, but I'm sure none of you will be surprised to hear that that's a flow country picture that we're looking at there. That's an example of blanket bog leading up to hills, which is a slightly less usual view of a blanket bog, which tends to be very, very flat. Okay, so we're going to go to our next page now, and we're going to talk a little bit about leisure and culture. These are things I mentioned in passing earlier on in the presentation, but I wanted to leave this section towards the end so it was fresh in our minds as we consider the Sluggins Peatland case study, as it's something that is sometimes not given the same amount of consideration as issues of biodiversity and climate change when we're considering natural heritage designations. So when it comes to the big designations, such as national parks like the Cairngorms, which we'll be looking at in just a moment, or World Heritage Sites such as the Lake District, it's perhaps more natural to consider how the public is going to use the space. Indeed, often the attraction of more members of the public, the attraction of tourists, is an aim of the creation of such a designation. These designations quickly turn the area into honeypot sites with thousands of people flocking to them every day in the summer, with both positive and negative impacts for local habitats and for local communities. For smaller, out-of-the-way places, however, sites designated for their natural heritage are also places of leisure and cultural significance. You've got dog walkers, cyclists, mushroom hunters, joggers, painters, bird watchers, wild swimmers, and a whole host of other enthusiasts who use these lesser known spots every day and view their local patch of natural heritage as a vital and wholly positive part of their lives and a real contributor to their quality of life. So when we're looking at a new or smaller designation coming into effect, it's worth considering how this is going to affect non-land holding locals. Could there be conflicts if dog walkers start seeing signs telling them that they must keep their dog on a leash during the ground nesting season in an area where before they got so much joy watching their dog running around? Might changes to fishing regulations bring an abrupt end to a family tradition of fishing in a particular spot? Could the designation of a site for its rare bird species bring hordes of twitchers to a previously quiet wild swimming spot? And then you've also got to think about the cultural practices that are associated with people's livelihoods. Crofting, if we look at muirburn, if we look at keeping sheep or other animals on common land, if designations change how this can be done, that can cause conflict also. It might be helpful before we go on to the Sluggins case study to think about these issues by looking at how a well-established national park manages the challenges and the opportunities of its natural heritage status. So for our last video today, we're going to look at the Cairngorms National Park. And this video really explains why the Cairngorms is a national park and what that does for the area. So not just for the habitat, not just for the mountains and the bogs, but what does it do for the local people and what does it mean to the wider Scottish and UK community? So the video is going to start in just a few seconds, and then after that we're going to consider the Sluggins case study. Okay, so I thought that was quite an interesting video to end on because it really looks at a natural heritage designation as a destination. And you might have picked up on the end there that this is a video that's maybe aimed at B&B owners, restaurant owners, maybe whoever's running that bungee jump over the river, to try and attract new people to the area, and how you can really sell the national park to people who are coming to stay. So there was a lot less about biodiversity. I don't think climate change was mentioned at all. It's really more about the visitor experience, which is an important element for some of these bigger national and international designations. But I think that's not what we're going to be considering for the Sluggans peatlands. We're going to be looking at something a little bit different, and this is the idea of a local nature reserve. So today's event has been leading up to the consideration of Sluggans peatland as a possible local nature conservation site, or an LNCS. I should say at this point that this is not an official Highland Council consultation on the idea of an LNCS, rather it's a thought experiment, using Sluggans to give some more focus to some of today's themes. So at this point I'd like to give credit to Nick Hodgetts, who's a botanist and former Scottish Wildlife Trust chair who's local to Portree, who contacted us several months ago to inquire about the possibility of a designation for Sluggans peatland, and helpfully indicated the area on the map. It's not an area I'd heard of before, and that's the map you can see in front of you now. So after talking to Nick about the idea, I also discussed the idea with the local area officer from Nature Scott for Skye and Lochoush, a man called Alex Turner. So I'd also like to thank him for his advice and for helping me to understand the area a little bit more. So I'm going to give a brief introduction to Sluggans. Oh, I've just seen a message from Dorothy who can't see the map. Katie, could you nod or shake your head? Can you see the map? You can. Okay, Dorothy, I'm afraid that might be a problem, and it might help if you log out and log back into Teams. So I find that sometimes helps. So I'm going to start by giving a brief introduction to Sluggans, which is based on the information I received from Nick and Alex, before giving an overview of the pros and cons of a potential local designation for the site. And then we'll come to that question at the end about whether or not Sluggans would benefit from a local designation. And we'll discuss that on the next page. So Sluggans peatland sits just outside of Portree, which is the settlement, the built up area you can see in the bottom right hand corner of the map. It's just behind a council recycling centre. So it's a locally important place due to its biodiversity, the extent and the quantity of carbon locked away beneath the surface, as with a lot of healthy peatlands. It's partly composed of old peat cuttings and partly of healthier bog. So we're not describing this as a pristine bog. While peatland is common across Skye, so not exceptional to find peatland here, and the west coast, this is one of the best quality bogs on the island. The bog is already mapped as Class 1 peatland, which would be interesting to the Highland Council planners, so it already demands quite a thorough assessment for any proposed developments. From this perspective, it may be that a local nature reserve for the area would not add much in the way of legislative protection. Indeed, this designation does not affect how landowners and land managers manage the land on a daily basis. Rather, it is a signal to planners and developers that there are natural features of merit, and it encourages them to consider the sensitivity of the site and how land use change might impact this. The main benefits then would be in raising awareness of this site to local nature lovers, to environmentalists and peatland enthusiasts, and also demonstrating a local commitment to recognising and protecting peatlands for their biodiversity and carbon capture benefits, and perhaps also adding a layer of scrutiny, if not legal protection, to future development proposals. So the investigation of this site as a potential local nature reserve would also bring together the Highland Council, Nature Scott, local organisations and residents to take a closer look at Sluggans, which may lead to better management of the site and more sensitive future use just by that collaborative approach. Another exciting benefit of creating a local nature reserve for sluggans would be that it would be the first one in the whole of the Highlands. As it stands, I believe we're the only local authority without a local nature reserve. We have similar designations in other areas, but this would be the first one. So while the Highlands is well covered in a whole range of other designations, it's quite surprising to find a designation which could apply to peatlands that we don't have in the Highlands, which is chock full of peatlands. So as I said at the start of this section, the purpose is not to hold a vote on whether or not sluggans should receive local nature reserve status. Instead, it's to start this conversation about what this might mean for the local area and for local people. And with that in mind, the final question, which we'll discuss on the next page as part of our discussion, will be, might sluggans benefit from a local designation? And what would you hope such a designation might achieve? It's always important to have that purpose in mind.